Well, why don't we get started? Hi, everybody. Welcome to session 6 of the Acadia Science Symposium. This is our workshop on conducting and communicating research in Acadia National Park. I'm Nick Fizichelli, President and CEO with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. We are a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service and Center for Inspiring Science, Learning, and Community for a Changing World. One of our big goals is to foster a community of science here in Acadia. This includes scientific research, science communication, and access and engagement. And you all are a big part of that community. So thanks for being here today, and look forward to hearing from you and thinking about how we can better support your science in Acadia and help tell your stories. And doing science in parks brings many opportunities that I think we can work on together to engage people in science, to increase public understanding and support for science, and to help support resources in parks, natural resources, cultural resources, as well as the visitor experience. There's much opportunity for science here in Acadia, and so thanks for being part of that. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to hand it over to Abe Miller-Rushing, who is the science coordinator with Acadia National Park and is one of the people that deserves much credit with creating this community of science here in Acadia. So over to you, Abe.
Thanks a bunch, Nick. And thank you everybody for coming. This is as Nick mentioned, this is our last of our symposium series, our science symposium series until the fall. And this has been a big change this year that kind of spilled over from fall of 2020. After 9 or 10 years of doing this the same way in person on the Schoodic Institute campus, this has been our big venture into transitioning the symposium to something that we can do virtually. And I want to really thank everyone who made this series possible during what has been a trying year for everyone. And so that includes Emma Albee, Katharine Schmitt, and Roy Gott, who did a lot of the organizing and technical support, all of the speakers who have spoken at the 6 different mini symposia that we've had so far, a lot of the Park and Schoodic Institute staff who have really helped out at different points along the way, and of course to you, our science community, who's kind of made these events really vibrant, even though they have been online, which has been great. We've been really pleased with the outcomes of these. I want to move into, before I get to introducing the first speakers in the session, I want to just mention a couple of housekeeping items. One is that this is being recorded, and it'll be posted on the Schoodic Institute YouTube channel later, after the session. Please mute yourself except during the breakouts. During the breakout sessions, we'll have plenty of discussion, and feel free to ask questions during the chat. We may have opportunities to address some of them during the transitions or between the breakouts. And so for today, for our last session, we have a great lineup of speakers who are going to talk about some of the logistics associated with doing and communicating research in Acadia, covering permits, communications, and adapting to COVID-19. And these are these logistics really help us track and archive the research that happens in the park, so that people 100 years from now can come back and know how to find what's going on. It helps us communicate that research to managers, visitors, and others who need it and can act on it. And they help us keep you and everyone else safe while you're doing your research. And of course, these processes that the speakers will be covering help us achieve our mission of the National Park Service, to preserve our natural and cultural resources and to educate and inspire the visitors who come. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to our first speaker, Emma Albee, who's going to talk about the research permit process.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the research permit process. So first, a little background, just so everyone is on the same page, so I don't throw around too many terms that you're not familiar with. So I'm going to talk about IRMA, which is the Integrated Resource Management Applications, which is a Park Service database of applications that help manage and deliver resource information to parks, partners, and the public. And so two of those applications, which I'm going to be talking about today, are RPRS, which is the Research Permit and Reporting System. And so that is where people can go on and apply for a research permit, get the permit, and also submit reports after they're done with their project. And then the data store, which is a database of documents and data sets about natural and cultural resources in the parks. And so then another question that people sometimes ask is, who needs a research permit? And so anyone collecting data and doing research in the park needs a permit. And one of the main benefit of having these permits is so that we can record the information that's happening, all the research that's happening in the park, and have it in this one RPRS, this one system. So it's all there. So now we're going to go through the process of research information flow in the park. So we're going to walk through this diagram on the right. So the first step is to create an account on RPRS if you don't have one already. And then you draft and submit your application. And so that includes things like the title of your project, your information, the purpose of your study, the dates of your study, if you're going to be collecting any specimens, all of that information. And then you can also attach documents. So if you have a proposal that you've already created, you can attach that. If you have gotten other permits, so if you're working in certain fields, if you're working with vertebrates, you'll need IACUC approval. If you're doing social science, you'll need IRB, or if you need other state agency permits, you can also attach those. And then it also includes information about specimens being collected. So we want to know what you plan to collect, how many, and where it's going to be stored. And part of that where stored is, will it be destroyed at the end or during your project, or is it going to be permanently retained? And in which the case is that it goes in the park collections. And so then the next set of steps is I receive the application and I send it out to park staff to review. And then I start drafting conditions depending on what the permit is about. So each permit has permit specific conditions. So if you're going to be doing surveys, we ask that you wear clothing showing your institutional affiliation. We have a COVID-19 safety condition that we've been adding to every permits for the last year or so. Every permit has a liaison. So that's a park staff person that you can be in contact with about when you will be doing your research actually out in the field. And if you have any questions specific to your project. Other conditions, if you're collecting for permit retention, we have a set of conditions that describes that process and the responsibility. There's park-specific conditions, which are things like leave no trace, sharing reports and data, and those go on every permit. And then there's also NPS general conditions, which there's a link on your permit. And so those are things like authority and responsibility. And they're not on each permit actually spelled out because the permits are already 5 or 6 pages. And if we had those, they would be very long. So the next set is once the permit is approved, it's emailed to the researcher and the liaison. And we ask you to sign the permit. And right now, because Abe and I are not in the office, we ask you to scan a copy and send it to us, and Abe will sign that and send it back, but also to mail us a copy so that when we do get back in the office, we'll have the physical signed copies because we need those for our records. And then all research permits expire by the end of every calendar year. So if you will be continuing your research for more than 1 year, you'll need to reapply. And that's just, it makes it easy for record keeping. So once your permit expires and you're done with your work for the year, you'll have to submit an investigator's annual report. And those are due by March 31st of the following year. And information in that includes, so if you have any updated information, the findings from the past year, which we prefer like a paragraph or two about what you did. It doesn't have to be super in-depth, but it's nice to just know, did you not do anything because your plans changed? Did you go out and actually find things? And then if you did collect specimens that were not destroyed, you can include that information at the bottom. And so sometimes you haven't destroyed them yet, but you will, but you can still include that information because they are sitting either in your lab or somewhere. So we still need to know where they are and what your plans are. Or if you plan to collect for permanent retention, of course, you can include that information too. And then, like I said, if the research will be happening the next year, you'll have to go on and submit an application to our New Year research permit. And this is easier than submitting the first application because it pulls a lot of the information from your previous application. So you just have to go in and update anything that has changed and add new dates for the next year. And so then once your study is complete, you can submit any final reports using RPRS. And so that is, so the IAR, the annual report, is a form that you fill out. So it asks you for findings and specimens and things like that. But the final report, you just attach a document and submit it. So it can be any type of document you have. It can be a journal article, it can be a written report that you've come up with, theses that you or a student has written, pretty much anything. And so you can fill out the information about that report, like title, authors, if it's copywritten, all that stuff, and attach it right in RPRS. And so then after your project is complete, or anytime during your research process, you can have the opportunity to share your research. So you'll hear a little bit more later on some opportunities to do that. And then some other ways are also, we have brown bag talks to park staff. So if you're interested in that, you can always reach out to ABRI and we can help schedule a brown bag with park staff. Sharing information for the park website, which Patrick is going to talk about later, and also working with park staff. So like I said, each permit has a liaison, so you can always reach out to that person and see your work might be relevant to what they're doing. And so then how can you see past research that has happened in Acadia? So there's two ways. So the first is, like I said, everyone submits investigator annual reports. And so the public can actually go on and see those. The public cannot see lists of permits, but you can see the list of IARs and see the actual IARs. So if you go on to RPRS and go to search up in the green bar, one of the pull downs is search annual investigator reports. And so I just put in Acadia, and this is the list that comes up, and I sorted it so the most recent are at the top. Sometimes there are ones that are sensitive because they deal with things like threatened and endangered species, so you will not be able to see those. You can see the name, but so like the 5th or 6th one down there is black because you cannot see that one because it's sensitive. And then the other way, which a lot of you I know are familiar with, is the IRMA data store. So Acadia has uploaded 3,700 references on the data store. Some of them have the full report, some of them are just the metadata about the report. And so these are things like the final reports from research, park reports, theses, older documents that we found where they were before research permits, but it's the same kind of idea. And so they have links and some PDFs for data, and we're trying to put more data onto IRMA so that people have access to that. And then there's also posters from the past in-person science symposiums. And then just a quick update on research in the park this year. So we have 25 permits so far, which is pretty on par for a usual year. We have around 80 in a typical year. And so there's 5 new research projects that are brand new that haven't been done before in the park. And so here's a map of the different sites. And so it shows the sites from the last 3 years. And you can see there's certain areas that have concentrations of points. There's a lot on Schoodic Point and in different places on MDI. And then we do have a couple research sites on Idaho, although that's harder to get to, so we don't have as many. And so this is one of the things I do with research permits is put every site on the map, which when we have 80 permits, we have, I think it was 700 research sites in a year. So it's a lot, but it's nice to see it all visually. And that is all I have on research permits.
All right, thanks a bunch, Emma. So next up, that was a great summary, Emma. Thank you. So next up, we have Patrick Kark, who's going to talk about communicating science with Acadia. And so I should mention that for questions during the breakout groups, there will be time to ask each of the speakers questions that you have. You'll be paired with the speakers that you with the topics that you indicated as preference when you were registering. And we'll have 2 breakout groups, and so that'll be there'll be time to ask and address questions there. All right, so over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Dave. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with all of you today about communicating science in Acadia National Park. It's probably one of my favorite things to tackle and work with people as a ranger here in the park. And I just want to check that everyone's seeing the screen all right. Awesome. All right, so first off, just a little bit about me and how I got into science communication. I came out to Acadia National Park 8 years ago as the Raptor intern, which is by far the coolest job title I'll ever have. It's all downhill from there. But it was during those experiences as a Raptor intern that I actually changed my entire view of what I was going to do. Initially, I was going to head back home for the winter, and then I had lined up to go into grad school out in Illinois the next year. However, out here working at the Peregrine Falcon Watch, you can see in the top left-hand picture there, I decided that I found a passion for communicating science and talking to people about conservation issues and research and climate change all throughout different aspects of their visits here at the park. And with that, I continued to come out here as an ornithology ranger for the next 7 years at Acadia National Park. But I also did a wide variety of different programs, and I threw in that picture of sunset there at the bottom left hand of your screen, because it's from that viewpoint that for 3 years I specifically led and gave a program on climate change and really tackled communicating those issues to a variety of visitors throughout each one of those summers. And the reason why I was inspired to really take on such a difficult topic to talk with visitors about and try to get them to understand the importance is because in 2016, I was able to participate in a program that came here to Acadia National Park called Iceland. And Icebook stands for Interpreters and Scientists Working on Our Parks. And it was a 3-year project, but in 2016, the first year, what was the most remarkable thing for me was for a week, we were able to meet up with Dr. Jacqueline Gill at the University of Maine and one of her grad students, Kit Hamley. And we talked about bog coring and paleoecology and studying the past, the ecology of the past of Acadia National Park and Maine. And this was just inspirational to me, holding that core sample that could represent thousands of years of history. Really inspired me to start developing this program and doing my best to communicate climate change to visitors throughout 2016 through 2018. I was the only one to do it in 2016, but we started grabbing a couple other more interpreters in 2017 and 2018. And what I like showing is the success of what happened. Roughly only each year was there about 3 or 4 interpreters from Acadia National Park giving programs specifically covering this research project. And we would probably only give about 1 of those a week. So each one of us would give 1 program a week throughout the summer. But this is the amount of people that we contacted on those Icebook specific programs in those 3 years, just over 5,000. And that is roughly 5,000 people that got to have those conversations with rangers about climate change and active research going on in the park because of that ability in 2016 for some of us to meet the researchers and really get a hands-on experience with what they're doing. And the reason why I think science communication is so important here in Acadia National Park is because of Acadia's science legacy. When Acadia National Park was founded, one of its founding statements was to be an outdoor laboratory for people to do research in. And that legacy continues today. And part of Acadia's story should be telling all about that science that happens here in the park year in and year out. And so really what it comes down here today, and with many of you who are interested in communicating science with Acadia National Park, is how do we develop that partnership or that relationship to begin telling your stories or start telling your research projects that you're doing in the park that are so important to the future of Acadia and the world in some aspect. And so really what the goal is here is to tell you guys, how do we get this to happen? How do we get researchers and then park rangers out of the Visitor Experience and Education Division here at Acadia to really collaborate and start to work on these projects? And so the first part off is that process does start with your permit. You have identified Acadia National Park as a place that you will be conducting your research. You've researched to Emma and you've gone through the process of submitting your permit there. But what makes successful science communication projects is if at the beginning of your research project, you are already thinking about what information you would like to convey about your project, how it's important to Acadia National Park or to the research field in general, and specifically what audience might you be targeting to have this information conveyed to, because all of those different factors really change maybe what medium or what kind of project we might do together to send out that message. So what will happen after you submit your permit is there's an Acadia Science Communication group here at the park that looks over all the permits that are submitted, and then what we'll most likely do to everyone is pick you to send out and ask you to fill out a research brief. These are relatively simple questions, just asking you to give a little more detail to describe what kind of project you'll be working at here in Acadia. You know, why is it important to the resources or the park itself? What might be interesting about it? And one of those parts is, are you willing to be taking pictures or video or give interviews during your time researching in Acadia, and or will you be comfortable with us being able to come out and observe your research, interview you, take pictures, so on and so forth. And that kind of leads us to the first thing, is that one of our goals that's really been, that we're really undergoing this year, because we want to be so thorough in telling all the stories of Acadia National Park, and one of those is the science, is that almost every research brief is going to get its own article page up on the park website. These will be able to explain your research to people who are interested, be it other researchers or visitors who might stumble across your research and or are actively looking for that kind of information when they're viewing the Park Service website. One thing that's a lot of fun about the national park website itself is down there at the bottom, in the bottom left-hand picture, you might see you might also like, and it has a few other icons and pictures there, integrated into the MPS system through a tagging system. So subject tags like research or climate change or lakes, ponds, you name it. It allows people to connect to other articles that are being written throughout the entire Park Service to connect those ideas and thoughts. And so as you're doing a project in the park and you've submitted a research brief, you will be getting most likely a research brief article here on our park website. What's going to happen then is that we have a little document, and we've taken that information from those research briefs, and now it's time to play matchmaker. And what we've really identified is that the best way to do that is to let park rangers on our side who are interested in the topic that you're researching to be able the ones to pick and begin to reach out to start collaborating on some sort of project. And that's definitely going to be focusing more on in the summer season through June and October. That's definitely going to be the best opportunities for larger science communication projects to happen, because the park visitor education and interpretation staff, I mean, it's times 6. We have roughly 30 interpreters during the summer, down to 8 in the summer out of the staff room. So definitely a lot of opportunities during that season to talk about it. But what we really want is allow the researchers and park staff to work together to create the best science communication projects. One thing I always want to say to really start building up that collaboration is that for people doing research in the park, take pictures, pictures, pictures. You never know what pictures might be useful. One of the big things there is through our education program, where we do a lot of reaching out to kids in classrooms or on field trips here in the park. You might think it might be a boring part of your process. It might just be documenting, but that on the flip side is excellent for us to show children and kids in school what the scientific process looks like. What you all as researchers are going through to come to your conclusions during these projects. And then I don't want to, send any people off if your project happens in the winter at Acadia National Park or any other of the off seasons. That research is also worthwhile to talk about, and we definitely want to do our best to tell those stories. It's just planning will have to be farther in advance, just because we have such limited people during the winter months. We'll need to be talking about it more and more to really develop some sort of science communication. What are those projects that you might be able to do here with the park? And again, it really depends on what stories you as researchers want conveyed and what audiences you're looking to target. But first off, park ranger programs. I mean, when there's current research in the park, our park ranger programs are going to reach tens of thousands of people each year, covering a variety of different topics. You name it, we are most likely giving some sort of program about it in the park. On the right-hand side, we have articles. This happens to be an article actually written by a researcher here in the park using some of our historical data sets and how he's used those in the past to help with his current research in the park. In the bottom right-hand there, we have video series. This is a video series from the 2nd century stewardship, which is a lot of research that's been going in the park, but videos, we have the capabilities of working on videos here in the park as well. So that might be the medium you might want to tell. And as well, in the bottom left-hand corner there, this year, we've actually been building a digital studio here at the park to use for digital interpretation, as well as relatively a studio space to do whatever maybe you will dream about to use that space for. Those are just some other pictures. We'll be looking to develop a podcast here at Acadia National Park, where we'll be talking about research in the park and other activities, trying to, again, to tackle those untold stories. We'll be doing live interpretation events throughout the park, piloting this year. probably starting with some of our long-standing ones like the Peregrine Falcon Watch and the Hawk Watch in the fall, but definitely opportunities to do a live interpretation interview from your research site if you wanted to, or who knows what we might come up with. And then of course, educational programming. Throughout in a year-long capacity, we have excellent education rangers working with kids from K through 12. And really, that is an excellent time for them to really be engaged in the scientific process and learn so much about Acadia National Park. And then what we really want to kind of wrap this back up into is those research briefs that you are putting onto the park website. What we want you to know is it doesn't stop there. It might be the only thing that ever ends up, but we don't want it necessarily to be. We want to document your process. So, you know, year one, you submit your annual report. Well, if there's any cool findings, you know, we want to add that to the brief. You know, it has been 4 years and your project's all said and done and you've written up your conclusion. Well, we want to add that conclusion to that. So there will be a long-standing documentation of those research projects here in Acadia National Park. Again, for other researchers to find and or interested people of the public that can use that for their science projects or just sate their curiosity. And with that, that's just my contact information. Feel free to write it down and reach out to me if you ever have any questions about it. But I look forward to answering any questions you all might have in the breakout sessions. And that is it for me, Abe.
Thanks a bunch, Patrick. That was great. And yeah, that was a super great introduction to that. And that is there are a bunch of new things that we're doing this year to communicate research that Patrick went over, that those of you who have been working in the park for a long time won't necessarily have seen in the past. But we're really trying to step up those efforts with Patrick and others on the visitor experience and education staff. And now we're going to hand it over to Katharine Schmitt, who will talk about other ways to communicate science in Acadia. Off to you, Katharine.
Abe, thank you, Patrick, for that great overview of all the options you have just for working with the National Park Service. And also thanks to Emma, I just want to highlight for everyone, it all starts with your research permit. So the communication process with the park really starts with that permit, because we use that, as Patrick described, to really think about what stories are coming up. So that information is really important, including those annual reports and finding out about the results. I'm going to talk just briefly about other options available, just to sort of give you a good overview of all the possibilities that are out there, as well as a little bit of guidance for kind of how to take the next step. But I'm really looking forward to the breakouts and answering your more specific questions. I'm going to start with an article. So at Schoodic Institute, I work closely with the park to communicate science, and as part of that science communication team that looks at research permits. And so you can work with Schoodic Institute to help with your content and help getting your stories on the web. As Emma mentioned, with 80 projects a year, it's enough to keep all of us busy. And so this is just an example of an article that I wrote about second century stewardship research, and from the researcher's perspective and my perspective, nps.gov was really the right home for this story. So we're part of that Park Service storytelling process. We also tell a lot of other stories at Schoodic Institute, tend to highlight sort of synthesis stories and historic overview stories, ones that might be a little more long form. This is just an example of a story about women who historically did work in Acadia's intertidal zone, and so it kind of covers a lot of different individuals. A couple other examples, I did an overview of air pollution trends in Acadia. last spring when everybody was talking about environmental impacts of sort of everything shutting down in the early days of the pandemic. Another example of a research publication that came out on the Dragonfly Mercury project. And this is an example of how at Schoodic, we can be a little bit more nimble and sort of responsive sometimes in getting things up quickly. And this was a case of this paper coming out and the researchers really wanting to get the word out, but it took them a while to go through sort of federal government processes to get a press release out. And so we were able to move a little bit quicker to share the information. The publication was already out in the peer reviewed literature. So we weren't, we were providing information that was available to anyone who wanted to find it. And then also through second century stewardship is a way that we're really telling stories that reach across the national park system. So if you're working in more than one park, if your work is sort of a theme that applies to multiple parks. So this is an example of work we did with another park out west. And so this was the right home for that story. And also there's a story about invasive plant work that includes Acadia, but really covers all of the Eastern US. So this is just another platform that we have access to and where there's stories that you can go look and see what else is on this website. Another option is to work with the media and work with freelancers. There's a lot of freelance science writers who that's their profession and they make a living off of telling science stories and telling them well, and they're always looking for new ideas. On the left is an example, Murray Carpenter is a freelancer based here in Maine, but he writes for the Washington Post, in this case, the New York Times, as well as National Public Radio. And so this was a story, my previous position at Maine Sea Grant, through some, what started as a press release about new research projects ends up as a story in the New York Times. The middle is an example from second century stewardship fellow Allison Gardner. And in thinking about her communication about her project, she really wanted to kind of get in front of her research, anticipating peer-reviewed papers and a little bit of concern about how the results might be portrayed by working closely with an interested reporter, in this case, Dick Broom of the Mount Desert Islander. She was able to help frame the story and be proactive about the message that she wanted to share regarding her research on ticks and habitat in Acadia. And then just another example from Sierra Magazine about climate adaptation in forests that featured Schoodic Institute work. You can also work with your institution. So a lot of you here are from the University of Maine. They're always looking for good stories, and all you have to do is send the office an email and let them know what you have going on. I'm just highlighting here on the centennial in 2016, there was a whole issue of UMaine Today dedicated to research in Acadia National Park and University of Maine's historic connections to the park. Another example from the University of Maine, second century stewardship fellow Alessio Morliti. This was an article in the magazine, but it also included a video and it also included some really wonderful photos. And when you work with your institution, you'll have access to some of that material as well. So it can give you things to put on your lab website or links to share on social media. Funders also really want to know about your research and what you're finding. So just like the Park Service wants to get updates and keep that information fresh on their website, funders want to know about your research as well. So here's just an example of a funder, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Another example from the National Science Foundation. So whatever entity is supporting your research, they might want to communicate through their channels. You can also do it yourself. So you can just produce your own content. You can do it through partnerships like The Conversation, and there's some other syndicated columns that work with researchers to write columns or opinion pieces, and so The Conversation is one of them. And this is second century stewardship fellow Stephanie Spera. And her motivation was really, there was a citizen science component of her research. And so she was really trying to get the word out about her research because she was seeking photos, historic photos of fall foliage in Acadia. Also the timing of this, so she had the great sort of seasonal news hook on her research of everyone sort of looking for fall stories. And so this fit well with that. Chris Nadeau made his own YouTube video, and he put it up himself on YouTube, but then the park once, you know, it's really one of the things you want to think about with your content, whether it's photos or video or audio, is making sure it's accessible. So in Chris's case, it just took a while to get the transcription and the closed captioning and the visual descriptions together. So then Acadia National Park could put it out themselves. But he actually, you know, he filmed the video and scripted it himself. Another example, 2nd century stewardship fellow Caitlin McDonough Mackenzie, who works in botany and plant ecology, and some of her peers were sort of upset about a paper that came out talking about plant blindness and how, because the public, you know, doesn't connect with plants and most stories are about animals, and they really got together themselves to communicate both in the scientific literature about the problems with that kind of language and sort of turning the narrative around to talk more about growing plant love. And then they also created a more public facing website called Plant Love Stories, where anybody can submit the story. More ways to do it yourself. Social media has given everybody a platform now. So there's an example from Instagram on the left hand of your screen. And I think these are really ways social media is a great way to share your expertise as well as to give back. And people are really interested in what scientists are doing. Who are they? So representation in science and the diversity that you can represent if you talk about the work that you're doing and your students are doing. And just the everyday, what it's like to be a scientist, day in the life kind of content is very popular. I have a picture of David Steen alongside Wildlife, who's on Twitter, and his whole thing is snakes. He's a conservation biologist, but he spends an hour of every day responding to tweets about snakes and people looking for help identifying snakes. And he sort of commits to that time, but he's the snake guy and everybody knows that. And I would say that he's probably done a lot to educate and raise awareness about snakes and why they're good. And a lot of other ways to find out who's doing what in different types of science and who else is doing research in national parks. So that's a lot of stuff I just threw at you, and Patrick gave you a ton of options as well. And so you might be wondering, you know, which one is right for you, and really it depends, right? So you got to know why you're communicating and what is your purpose. And there's a lot of reasons why you should communicate, right? You owe it to your funders, especially if they're taxpayers. If you're doing research in Acadia, you're working on public lands. And so I think that carries an obligation to communicate with the public about your research. You can counter stereotypes and really demystify science. You can inspire the next generation of scientists. Because you are working in parks and a lot of you are working on conservation and environmental related projects, you owe it to the earth to tell people what you're doing and what you're finding. There's some selfish reasons too. You can improve collaboration with other disciplines, improve your own research, advance your career, and it can really help you to keep your joy and sanity, to give yourself another outlet. And then the second thing it depends on is who your audience is. So you need to know your audience. You need to think about who they are and what you want them to do. What are you asking of them? What outcome are you hoping to achieve with your communication? How will you know if you're successful? So thinking about those two questions is really going to help you then narrow down your list of options for communicating. And then just some final words of advice is to be prepared. So remember the curse of knowledge. Remember that a third of high school graduates don't even go on to college. Remember that a very small percentage of people who do go to college major in science, and even an even smaller percentage get a master's degree, and a fraction of that percentage get a PhD degree in a natural science field. And so what this means is that you have a lot of knowledge and information, and it can become a barrier to communicating with people, because once you know something, it's really hard to remember what it was like to not know that. And one of the ways that this really manifests itself is in jargon and the language and the vocabulary that we use to talk about our research and our science. And this is where messaging and crafting a message, can you talk about your research in 250 words, 50 words, 5 words? And practicing talking about your message can help you to be prepared, whichever option you choose for communicating. Now, all of your knowledge is also a blessing, because you are part of this really elite squad of people who are paying attention to what's happening in parks, who are studying very specific topics, and you know a lot of information that other people are interested in hearing about and maybe need to hear about. And so, you know, think of that knowledge, it's a curse, but it's also a blessing. The last couple things to think about are sort of timing. The column on the left are sort of the newsworthy moments in the life of a research project. And a lot of times communication is only thought of at the end of this, when a publication comes out, or some, you know, rarely actually some impact results from research that happened 10 years ago. But really communication starts at the very beginning, when you have your idea for the research, when you get your grant, when you submit your research permit. So think about, again, depending on your audience and your goal, when is the right moment during your research to communicate? And then remember that just like research costs money, communication costs money. So what other training or assistance do you need help with? And what is it going to cost to do what you want to do and to do it well? This is just a rough sampling of estimates of what different kinds of communications products cost and the amount of time associated with those products. And I'm happy to answer specifics later. This is just sort of a summary. So there's, you know, the other options that you have in addition to working with the National Park Service, and things to think about as you prepare to work with the Park Service, or work with Schoodic, or work with the media, or go out and do it yourself. Just a few things to think about. And then finally, if you want to communicate, and wherever you are in your, you know, work to be a science communicator, I want you to start reading. When you read about science, you know, read it the way a writer would read it. Listen to audio and podcasts the way a sound recorder would be listening to those productions. Watch movies and commercials the way a director might watch them. And then share that content that you do like and why you like it. And is it. And I'm happy to talk. I can't wait to talk more about it in the breakout.
Thanks a bunch, Katharine. That was great. Thank you. And so, yeah, so that you can see there are tons and tons of ways to communicate research in the park, and with a lot of different partners and media and whatnot. So with our last presentation before the breakouts, I'm gonna hand it over to Kate Ruskin, who's going to talk about adapting research to COVID-19.
Great, thanks, Abe. Thank you, Abe. So you heard from me a little bit at the opening session, and so I'm going to give a little more detail, focusing in particular on what challenges and opportunities arose from adapting the research I had planned for summer 2020 to the COVID-19 situation. So in this last summer, I set out with a couple of undergraduate researchers from the University of Maine to study Acadia's freshwater resources. They are used by many different stakeholders for many different activities, and they also have a range of jurisdictions. They're not all owned or governed by the National Park Service. Some are municipal water sources, some are governed by the state. It's complicated. And so that makes this a good system to study stakeholders' perceptions and values about how resources on public lands are used. So we set out with this question: how do Acadia National Park's diverse stakeholders think its freshwater resources should be used? We expected to spend the summer with a couple of undergraduate students down in Acadia National Park, intercepting visitors with paper surveys and some on iPads as well, to survey them about what role, what stakeholder group are they in? Are they a local resident versus a visitor, for example? And what do they think about the various uses of Acadia's freshwater resources? However, because of COVID-19 hitting, we wound up shifting gears. And I wanted to mention in particular Dominique Despirito, who is a UMaine undergraduate student, the first hired on this project, where this was her summer plan. And she did manage to get in about 30 in-person surveys in the fall of 2019. But as of March, we had to pivot. So what we wound up doing was, rather than sending students to intercept visitors in the park, we put out signs with QR codes. That was thanks to Andrea Knapp, another UMaine undergraduate student who is from Sullivan, so not far away. And she had been hired as a summit steward in Acadia over the summer. And so it worked out well because she was able to drop the signs off on her way to her other assignments for the day. And then we also did a lot of targeting of stakeholders online. So we reached out to local listservs, we reached out to local Facebook groups, and directly to contacts in the local community. This work was thanks to Louise Chaplin, another UMaine undergraduate student who grew up on the Cranberry Isles. And so she is a member of the MDI community and was able to leverage that network to get our survey out to many stakeholders of Acadia's freshwater resources. I'm sorry, I'm just realizing I'm near my turtle tank and he's moving around. So apologize for any background noise. So at the end of the summer, we had sort of intensive surveying from, well, intensive, I'll tell you just how intensive, mostly in June and July. And we wound up with over 500 responses through these pivoted modified methods. So we had a lot of visitors, as you can see, over 300, fair number of local residents as well. Not represented in this pie chart are educators, researchers, and students, college students, because the sample sizes were relatively small, which we would have expected due to the proportions of the different populations, but we've excluded them from some of our analyses just because of the small sample sizes. So some interesting preliminary results we've found so far is that there were many uses of Acadia's freshwater resources for which there was a lot of consensus across the stakeholder groups. So people were generally very supportive. So on a scale of strongly supportive to strongly disagree, of using freshwater resources for wildlife habitat, safe drinking water, education, research, and recreation opportunities. There were some uses, however, where stakeholder groups were more divided. Supporting the tourism industry was one of them, swimming and fishing, recreational fishing. And this is what that looks like. So this figure I know is a fair bit to take in. So what you can see here is on the y-axis, we have a scale from strongly agree for this activity, which is that freshwater resources should be managed to support the tourism industry, to strongly disagree. Where the circle is oriented on that y-axis gives you a sense for whether the stakeholder group is supportive or not of that activity. And the diameter of the bubble is proportionate to how much consensus there is, with a big bubble meaning that there was little consensus within that stakeholder group. So for this example of tourism, you could see that visitors had a lot of consensus that they were generally supportive of using freshwater resources to support the tourism industry, whereas local residents were more divided and less supportive of using freshwater resources to support the local tourism industry. However, a really interesting result that we had was that if we asked these same questions in a different format, that the answer changed, or the result changed for some of the activities. So when we asked survey respondents to, instead of expressing support, rank these different uses of Acadia's freshwater resources, there were some flips, I guess, of the results. So for tourism, for example, we saw disagreement when we looked at expressing support, but all stakeholder groups on average ranked tourism as the lowest priority among all the other uses of Acadia's freshwater resources that we inquired about. So what helped in pivoting our research to adapt to the COVID-19 restrictions? One, very helpful contacts at the National Park Service and Schoodic Institute. Thank you particularly to Emma, Abe, Katharine, and Adam, who helped with, pushing through modified permits, giving advice about putting out signs and changing these methods, as well as Maine staff. I can't speak for other institutions, but at the University of Maine, we had to add additional layers of permissions. And so there were a lot of extra steps of review that its administrators oversaw and helped with to ensure that researchers at UMaine were being safe while conducting research. Local ins definitely help. So the fact that I had 2 students that I knew of who were going to be in the MDI community over the summer, it was important to me to not bring new people to the MDI community to do this research, that they had local, they were already there, in one case had lots of local contacts, and could do this work by traveling solo in vehicles and not interacting with visitors, was important to make this successful. I learned that it was really helpful to put signs where people were loitering. And so we tested out many locations for putting these signs, and found that really we basically only got good responses on places like Cadillac Summit, at visitor centers, places where people were loitering because they're waiting for their family member to get out of the bathroom or they're enjoying the view. So it makes sense, times when people would be more apt to take out their phone and scan a QR code because they've got a little downtime. And an approach I used was to keep my expectations low in terms of what I would be allowed to do and work toward that to avoid having to continue to pivot mid-season. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, I had thought about aiming for in-person surveys with distancing and extra sanitation of the iPads and whatnot. But in the end, I just decided to operate under the assumption that the restrictions were going to be severe and just develop a plan that adapted to these sort of the worst case scenario. And I found that it worked really well. For comparison, putting the sign out for, daylight hours, 2 days a week, yielded over 500 surveys over the course of 2.5 months. Whereas a few years earlier, I had 2 students working about 6 hours a day, 3+ days a week at Schoodic, for more than 2.5 months, and we got almost 800 surveys. So to me, it was really good bang for my buck in terms of student effort and the cost associated with that. However, it was not without challenges. So as I mentioned, I had to navigate increased layers of permissions and administration. I suspect that the respondents were a different sample of these populations than there would be with intercept surveys, just because we're talking smartphone users who know what a QR code is and how to scan it and are more willing to do so. I have not yet investigated exactly how they would be different in terms of their demographic parameters. And one thing that I think was a particularly regrettable loss is the shooting the breeze information that you get from having boots on the grounds on any research site. So building relationships with landowners or stakeholders. And so unfortunately with remote surveying, we didn't have an opportunity to do that. But again, I saw many challenges or opportunities as well. So greater yield in terms of responses per unit effort. Different sample demographics, that could also be a strength. So getting responses from people who might not normally be responding to paper intercept surveys. I also think this work highlighted an increased capacity for science communication. If I had known I was going to do this from the start, I would have prepared a website that linked to the QR code as well, so that I could share information about the project and the research questions, my team, my department, in a sort of preemptive way, as opposed to toward the end of the research cycle when I'm sharing results. And I also think that having to adapt research to COVID-19 restrictions provides new research questions. So I personally think that human beings are in the process of renegotiating our relationship with nature because of all of the restrictions imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We've already seen a proliferation of research, and this is actually from a few months ago, related to COVID and its effects on outdoor recreation. Here's just a sample of one study that came out very quickly after the onset of the pandemic. And so while I was, revising my permits to include remote surveying methods, I threw in a few extra questions as well to characterize the impacts of COVID-19 on Acadia's visitation. So asking questions like, are you, the survey respondent, doing more or less outdoor recreation on your trip due to COVID-19? Did the pandemic affect your trip planning? And what are your perceptions of risk associated with outdoor recreation coming to Maine and Acadia National Park? Here are some very preliminary results. I've used approximations because we are still in the process of proofing our data, but there was a large majority of people said that they were doing more outdoor recreation on their trip compared to less because of COVID-19. More than 50% of people said that yes, COVID-19 affected their trip. But I'm surprised that there were about 40% who said no, but as I've pondered it more, I think that's because Acadia does lend itself to COVID-friendly travel with its outdoor recreation opportunities, a lot of personal vehicles. And people generally perceived that there was low risk of COVID-19 due to, or in the course of recreating outdoors. However, we did see shifts in people's perceptions between what they thought before they arrived at the park versus when they were there. And so I think for many people, they perhaps were a little surprised at how crowded the park was and that changed their perception of risks associated with visiting. So here's my contact information, as well as Dominique's, an undergraduate student I've been working with on this project. Thank you to the funders and supporters that we have for this project, as well as Louise, Andrea, and Shannon, all EES majors at UMaine who helped by deploying these remote surveying methods. And thank you. I welcome any questions you have about adapting your research to COVID in the breakout rooms.
Great, thanks, Kate. That was awesome. It's especially cool seeing brand new results there. Those are like super brand new, right?
Yes, this morning.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, so thank you to all of the speakers. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to shift to breakout groups. And so this will be a chance for you to talk in smaller groups and get closer interactions with each of the speakers. And we're going to make these breakout groups about 15 minutes each. And so we'll do 2 rounds and it'll be a chance to ask your questions. There's no particular prompt, so you can kind of take the conversation wherever you want to go. And I think that's all that I need to do for that part. And Roy, do you want to just go ahead and break us out? Well, welcome back, everybody, so we're going to shift into new breakout groups, but I have to hold us here for a minute or two while Roy reassigns our breakout groups. So does anybody have any questions that you want to ask the whole group, or comments, like insights that you want to share from your breakout group?
I really liked what Martha was saying about both with photography and like sometimes the fear or apprehension that especially young kids, or even those people like myself maybe that are older and going back into school, that they have apprehension about getting into science, and maybe they think that they're not right for it, or they can't do it. But she made a good point. Like, she said something about taking a picture of you as a child and then taking a picture of you now. And it's like, that's really cool, like to have that comparison. Because I'm a veterinarian and I have a picture of me, on a step in my front yard with my first puppy when I was like 4. And I kind of knew that that's where I was headed. But so I thought that that was a really neat point that she made. So that was really, really fun to hear.
Yeah, great. Anybody else want to follow up on that or ask any questions or other comments from breakout groups?
It was very nice. Helpful.
Yeah.
Helpful.
Great. Awesome. Can we, so it looks like Roy's ready to, so we can go back out into breakout groups and then we'll finish up. I think everybody's back. Thank you, groups. Any final comments that anybody has to share before we just totally wrap up? No? All right. Well, I'm glad. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. After this, Emma will send out an email in the next few days or week with a link to the recording and a list of participants. A little bit later after that, we're planning to send out a survey about this year's Science Symposium, the online version, and see what you like and what you liked and what you didn't like and how you'd like it to work in future years. I think our intent is to, when we can go back to the in-person, to have the in-person Science Symposium, but to also continue the virtual version as well. And so we would like your feedback in terms of how we can make this better going forward. And lastly, I'd like to thank everybody who's really made this possible. Again, Emma and Katharine and Roy, Patrick and Kate for our today's speakers and all the other speakers for this symposium, and the Park and Schoodic Institute staff and you guys for coming. Really, really appreciate it. And you're what make this science community work and really help us do our job, protect Acadia and keep it healthy for future generations. So thanks a bunch.